Good morning. I'm Mark Murphy, and I want to welcome you to this morning's Cisco Chat with Intel and Cisco. Joining me here this morning is Jay Sri Subramania from Cisco, the Partner Solutions Director for our Internet of Things solutions, and Brad Hazinski from Intel, who is the Global Business Director for our relationship here at Cisco. So let's kick this off. A couple of things right off the bat. If you're following us on Periscope, make sure you're following us at Cisco_IoT or at Intel IoT or at Cisco DC. So let's get right to the questions. First of all, let's start off with how do you define IoT? Jayshree?
Keeping it really simple, it's really the intelligent connection of smart devices and things. It's as simple as that. That's how we look at it at Cisco.
Wow, that's simple. Connecting devices. Brad, how about you and Intel?
I think we're very much in accord with what Jayshree said. In particular, you're connecting, devices, but people, and all aspects of an interconnected world. I think we view that holistically as what we define as IoT.
Yeah. So, if you look at it, Internet of Things is really an industry term, and at Cisco, we've taken it to the next level along with Intel. We're talking about not just the things, we're talking about data, people, process, and how it all connects together for that smart connectivity for, the business benefits that we really need to see in the world today.
Right. I mean, and also just to carry on, we hear about the Internet of Everything. So talk a little bit about what the Internet of Everything, the Internet of Things, what's the difference? Are they the same?
Yeah, I think the way, so Intel, a little different nomenclature between Intel. Intel defines the Internet of Things, I think, in a holistic view, the same way that Cisco defines Internet of Everything. I think that's really about how do you take all of these billions of connected devices, and then how do you, when you drive, this is going to drive a lot of data, and when you drive this data across the entire network spectrum, okay, into the cloud or into the back-end data center, I think when you look at the holistic approach of that defining architecture from end to end, this is, I think, where Cisco and Intel agree that this is what they call the Internet of Everything.
Yeah. So it's really the power of the Internet of Everything, and Internet of Things is just a subset. The way we look at it, it's a subset of the Internet of Everything. So what's really driving the adoption of the Internet of Things is really the business benefits, operational efficiencies, better business services, better business quality across the different industries. So Internet of Things, Internet of Everything, the results are going to be the same.
Nice, great. As we move into this world of the Internet of Things or the Internet of Everything, there are real-life examples already. So, Jayshree and Brad, I'd love to hear what are two things or one specific example from each of you that you're already seeing as an example of the Internet of Things or the Internet of Everything.
So there are so many, it's really difficult to pick one, Mark. So you look at it and saying, in every single industry, what are really the killer apps, right? So that's really driving the industry moving forward, from manufacturing to smart cities to utilities itself. My personal example that I look is the environment, and I have a very interesting one about the Great Barrier Reef, where there are sensors on floaters where they look at the sensors are collecting information, the physical data, the chemical data, and to see how the reefs are going to be protected. That's an exciting one, and there's so many, in healthcare, retail, there's so many examples.
Right, that's super cool. Brad, what's yours? Top that.
Well, I tell you, that's a tough one to top, but the reality is there's so many examples from inside the home. One example is retail. I think retail is what Intel would consider one of the more mature verticals. We've been working in the smart retail space for some time with our embedded products for digital signage, etc. I think that the retail experience will then transform in the way that, imagine when you walk into your favorite store, maybe a Nordstrom, and you walk in there and they know based on a profile, so that they will be able to do an analytics. They'll know your age and sort of what your buying patterns are, and then all of a sudden a smart sign that you walk by says, hey, we have Kenneth Cole on sale over there in the men's department, 40% off. So really changing the way a smart shopping experience for folks so that they can get in and out of the store as quickly as possible. And you could permeate that through almost any retail environment around the world.
So it's a Tom Cruise movie you're talking about.
Yes.
We're going to live that.
Yes.
It's just going to be amazing.
Yes.
We used to walk around a few years back with those Bluetooth, and now it's like waving arms and, the Internet of Things.
As long as it's not Tom Cruise dancing in his underwear, whatever that one was, where he's in the living room.
Okay, and we're moving on to the next question. No, that's really exciting, and it is fun to think about, the Great Barrier Reef and the practical example of saving our planet, hopefully there. Or again, the shopping experience of walking in and all of a sudden it knows Mark Murphy because I have a chip in my head, or
You know what? I think something. I mean, that's an interesting concept, right? I mean, the reality is something that I think people do look at when it comes to Internet of Things is what about privacy? And so, privacy is something I think that all the companies need to come together as a consortium to say how do we define these standards and how do we define these experiences, but keep people's. That's why security. I think if you look at security being such an important aspect of everything that both Intel and Cisco are driving into the marketplace, I think John and Chuck made it very clear yesterday that security is the underpinning or the umbrella of everything that needs to occur here, because without secure data in an unsecured world where you have billions of connected devices, that's a real challenge.
To make it really realistic, right, we are at the very early stages. Security, privacy, compliance, we are at the very early stages. So together as an ecosystem, Intel, Cisco, together with a number of other partners, we're trying to figure this out in terms of what are the standards, and the regional standards, global standards, architectures, the frameworks. It is still at the very early stages, and it's exciting times.
it is exciting. It's so groovy to think about all of these changes that are happening, that are coming, that people are talking about, and it might seem early today, but it's coming. It's coming. And it's no longer a hype.
Absolutely.
There's so many stories around the globe, across the different industries. It's here to stay.
So with the Internet of Things, there are many other pieces of technology or systems or solutions that are going to need to support it. So the question is really, how is it that data centers are going to change? So Brad, I'm going to point this one to you. Talk to us about data centers and what needs to happen with the data center as it relates to the Internet of Things.
Sure. I think one of the most interesting aspects that, again, John and Chuck discussed yesterday is that to be prepared for an exponential growth in the amount of connected devices. I think he mentioned up to 500 billion connected devices in the next so many years. So what are those devices going to do? They're going to drive data. So you're going to have a lot of data coming out of a lot of devices. So the first thing that needs to happen is the network needs to transform. So as you get back in across the network, but even into the data center, I think you're going to see a much faster move. Customers moved pretty slowly from 1 gig to 10 gig, but I think you're going to see a transition from 10 gig to 40 gig to 100 gig very quickly, because you need bigger pipes to move all that data. Also, I think inside in the back-end data center, the technologies around Intel and what we're doing with our processors, what we're doing with next-generation non-volatile memory technologies, we see that all of these devices are going to drive an insatiable amount of data coming into the data center. This data needs to be analyzed, it needs to be stored, it needs to be sorted through. So it really drives the compute requirement on the back-end data center, as well as out into the cloud. So.
Wow. And Jayshree, a little bit more about maybe specifically what Cisco's doing as it relates to the data center in particular with IoT?
So we're really building up the IoT, the purpose-built devices, right? When it comes to switches, routers, and working very closely with Intel, the UCS side of it, the servers, the rack mount servers that we already have. And we've been all talking about the cloud, and now moving it to the edge and the compute that is required at the edge, when it comes to an oil rig, the amount of data that you mentioned, exabytes amount of data, and the processing that's needed. So data center, there is, again, room to grow there, especially with the IoT world moving forward.
Perfect. It's so interesting to me. I've been in technology for a long time, and we're introducing new terms and new phrases all the time. So Jayshree just mentioned the edge, and we'll get there in just a second. But the other one to me, which is fun, because I live in San Francisco, and as you may know, the weather in San Francisco is very foggy, and we love our fog, and we call it, our air conditioning. But fog is now a term and a phrase or part of technology that we're talking about as it relates to the Internet of Things. So let's help me and others that are listening and watching. Talk to us about fog.
Sure, I think fog is, and I'll let Jayshree add her comments as well. I think fog to us is really the idea that as you look at certain scenarios and rollouts of some of these verticals for the Internet of Things, this large amount of data that I just mentioned, there are going to be cases where you do not want to wait for that data to get all the way back into the data center to be analyzed. A perfect example would be, look at what we're doing with smart cities. You have a case where you have smart traffic light, and you're going to be running, a smart city would be monitoring pedestrian flow, traffic flow throughout the city. It needs to be analyzed real time so that if the traffic lights in the city are going to make real time adjustments to move traffic flow, then that needs to be analyzed there on the network. So imagine fog being the idea that you can take some of the compute capabilities which traditionally reside in the data center and bring them out to the edge of the network where you're doing some of the big data and analytics right there at the edge of the network. And I believe John and Chuck, again, I think they said about 30 to 35%, somewhere in that range is where they predict that most of the 30 to 35% of big data analytics will be done at the edge of the network versus back end in the data center.
That's cool. Jay Shree, tell it.
Yeah, he just explained fog computing, very clearly looking at the compute that's needed because of the low latency, the high bandwidth. It's the sensors. Think about all the different industries. There's so many sensors and just the traffic lights, oil rigs so far away, and there is no need to push all the data to the cloud and back. There are decisions, smart decisions that can be made in real time with fog computing.
So in the Great Barrier Reef and the coral reefs that you were talking about, where would the fog computing be taking place? On the reef, on the floaty, and where would it be taking place?
It all depends on the business case itself. Here what we're doing is from sensors, the data that's coming from the sensors, depending on the location and as how the distance between the base station, there are decisions that are being made there in terms of making sure that divers don't go that day or that week it's closed. So there are decisions that are being made.
And so then let me just go back, if I may. I forgot who mentioned the edge. So talk about the edge a little bit and what that means.
And it's really the same. So we look at fog computing, edge computing. It's really the same. The new term is fog computing at the edge.
Yes. Okay. So yeah, fog computing is effectively a nice name for edge computing in itself, right? And how do we define the growth for compute at the edge of the network to consume all the data?
So for people who are technical, they're clearly going to be understanding all this because they're building the code and they're writing the applications. They're doing the work. But for the lay person out there who's having to sort of really quickly come up to speed, I think this is helpful just to get everybody to understand we're throwing around edge and fog and all of this every day. It's the same.
One and the same.
Groovy. Let's finish with thinking ahead. The Internet of Things has been around. This isn't new. Clearly, there are use case scenarios in place today. I remember the days of the RFID tags from 10, 15 years ago. So we've been talking about chips and computing outside of a server for quite a while. Look forward 1 year, and look forward. I'm going to ask you 5 years. I mean, it's crazy, but look forward 1 year, and look forward 5 years. Where do you think will be, and what conversation would we be having next year? Brad, I'll start with you.
Sure, I think we just hit on it. I think the fog computing aspect and the aspect of edge analytics and the edge computing is going to be the big topic of the next year. I think that understanding, because you need to solve these challenges, right? In order to understand it, how do you effectively set up like a smart city? When I utilize that example of traffic. By the way, I also want to make a quick shout out that we have the Cisco fog demo in the Intel booth right now at Cisco Live. So we're demoing it, and I think when Chambers comes through later, we're going to show it to him. So we're really excited to have that. Thank you to Cisco for letting us show that in our demo booth. But the reality is I think this fog is going to be big, and I think as you move forward, I think also if you pay attention to some of the themes in the discussions yesterday as well about how cities are going to start competing with each other. Municipalities are going to start competing with each other. People are going to start thinking about smart, efficient cities throughout the world. And I think you're going to see a whole new level of maybe people even choosing, how do people choose where do I want to live? That may change over the next 5 years, right? Urbanization, understanding, well, I want to go live in a city that I know is far more advanced in everything that they're looking at from a smart and connected everything. So I think I think we're not really ready for this world as it's moving so exponentially. It's really hard to look out, I think, 5 years and say, really, what does the world look like? Which is kind of exciting.
And that's Tom Cruise movies. Yeah. Right.
Yes, we do.
Jay Shree, talk to me about what do you think? Where are we going to be in a year?
Yeah, just like what Mark was talking about, urbanization, cities, I really look at it in terms of we're still at the very early stage, which is scratching the surface, and we're bringing the ecosystem together. So I think the pie is huge, and we're here to stay. It's no longer a hype. I look at it across the different industries. What are the industries saying when it comes to IoT? Some of the industries mentioned to us that they've been doing it for a few years in the industrial automation side of it. Now we're calling it the IoT. So one of the most important things is looking at what are the killer apps, industry to industry. What's the business outcome? Efficiencies. I think that's where it is. Once we cross that stage, there is room for a lot more.
That's super. That's exciting. Well, Jayshree, thank you so very much for the conversation today from Cisco. And I know there's a lot of great things happening at Cisco related to the Internet of Things. And Brad, Intel, I know, is the underpinning with the chip, doing everything. Thanks for joining us today. Super exciting. And to everyone out there on Periscope, again, really great conversation today talking about what Cisco and Intel are doing together as it relates to the Internet of Things, or the Internet of Everything. And, a couple of provocative things that we were talking about. What about security? What about the information? What about the data? Who owns it? Who gets it? Where does it go? There's a lot more discussions. And, and you'll see a lot more coming up over time. Again, we'll just finish with, if you're watching on Periscope, if you're listening, you can follow this conversation and continue it at Cisco_IoT, or you can follow us at Intel IoT. And the final is at Cisco DC for data center. Thank you so much for joining us today on this issue of Cisco Chat.